There's an official warning sitting on maritime advisory boards right now that most people will never see, written in the flattest, most bureaucratic language imaginable, and it might be the single most alarming document to come out of this entire war. The Joint Maritime Information Center has just raised the threat level for the Strait of Hormuz to severe. Not elevated, not heightened. Severe, the top of the scale, triggered by 6 separate Iranian attacks since the 12th of June. Mine risk reporting inside the shipping lanes themselves, deliberate navigation interference, and continued harassment of vessels by Iran's Revolutionary Guard Navy. And within hours of that classification going out, Iran issued a warning of its own, promising what it called grave consequences for any U.S. ally involved in what's happening right now in this waterway. Advisory boards like this one don't make headlines the way a missile strike does. Nobody posts a screenshot of a maritime threat classification and watches it go viral. But for the people whose job is actually keeping ships and their crews alive in contested waters, this kind of document carries more weight than almost any political statement from either government, because it's built entirely from incident reports, not intentions. It doesn't care what Washington or Tehran says they're trying to accomplish. It only tracks what's actually happening to real vessels in real time, and right now what's happening has pushed the rating as high as it goes. To understand why a single word, severe, matters this much, you need to understand what these threat classifications actually mean in practice. They're not political statements, they're operational guidance, written by maritime security professionals whose entire job is separating genuine danger from noise. A severe rating means the advisory board considers deliberate hostile action likely under current conditions. Not possible, not elevated risk, likely. That's the language maritime insurers read before deciding whether to cover a voyage at all. And it's the language shipping companies read before deciding whether their crews are walking into something they can't get their people out of if it goes wrong. When that rating gets raised, it isn't theater. It's professionals telling the entire global shipping industry, in the most careful language available to them, that the water ahead is no longer simply risky. It's expected to be hostile. President Trump, for his part, wasn't being careful with his language at all. He declared the ceasefire with Iran effectively over, framing this new round of American strikes on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a direct consequence of Tehran's own actions. And Iran's answer wasn't quiet diplomacy behind closed doors, it was a public promise of grave consequences, aimed specifically at the allies helping the United States carry out this operation. That detail matters, because it's not just a warning to Washington. It's a warning to every country whose ships, bases, or logistic support are tangled up in what the U.S. is doing right now in this waterway. An attempt to widen the circle of who should be afraid of what comes next. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Navy went even further in its own separate statement, delivered the same week, insisting that foreign powers have no stake whatsoever in the Strait of Hormuz, and that any U.S. involvement in determining shipping routes through it would trigger what they called a crushing response. They accused Washington directly of adventurism and interference, and warned that American bases across the region would be targeted again if what they described as U.S. aggression continues. There's an odd contradiction buried inside the same statement worth sitting with for a moment. The IRGC also claimed that Iran had actually increased vessel transit through the strait over the past 2 weeks on its own terms, but said recent American actions had seriously disrupted that reopening process. In other words, Tehran's own telling of events isn't that the strait was closed and America is trying to force it open. It's that Iran was already opening it carefully, on its own schedule, and Washington's strikes wrecked that process before it could finish. But underneath all of these dueling statements, something has quietly shifted that changes how seriously every one of these warnings should be taken. And it's the part of this story that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention. Mojtaba Khamenei, son of the supreme leader killed in the war's opening strikes back in February, has now been formally appointed as Iran's new supreme leader, with the direct backing of the Revolutionary Guards. For months, his continued absence from public life raised questions about his health, his authority, even whether he was still alive. That uncertainty is now resolved, and what's replaced it is arguably more significant. According to current reporting, the Revolutionary Guards are now widely seen as the dominant force in Iran's political and military decision-making, meaning the organization issuing threats of crushing responses and grave consequences isn't just Iran's most aggressive military branch anymore. It's effectively running the country, with a new supreme leader who owes his position directly to their support. This is a genuinely significant change in how Iran's power structure actually functions, not just a ceremonial title changing hands. Under his father, the Revolutionary Guards operated as one powerful institution among several, competing at times with the regular military, with the diplomatic corps, with clerics who held their own independent influence over state decisions. A supreme leader who was installed specifically because the guards backed him is a very different kind of leader than one who inherited broad-based legitimacy across multiple institutions. It suggests a narrowing of who actually controls decision-making in Tehran right now, concentrated more tightly around the single faction that has consistently pushed the most aggressive posture throughout this entire war. The same faction now openly promising crushing responses and grave consequences on the exact waterway this whole conflict keeps returning to. Think about what that actually changes. For most of this war, Iran's public statements have come from a mix of sources, government ministries, state media, IRGC officials, sometimes contradicting each other slightly depending on who was speaking. A formally installed supreme leader, backed explicitly by the military faction that's been the most aggressive actor in this entire conflict, removes a lot of that ambiguity. It suggests the voice threatening grave consequences this week isn't a rogue military branch freelancing beyond its authority. It's now speaking with something much closer to the full formal backing of the Iranian state itself. That's a different kind of threat than the ones this war has produced so far. And it's happening at the exact moment the maritime industry's own risk assessment just hit its highest possible rating. Layer onto that the 6 confirmed attacks since June 12th alone, a pace of roughly 1 significant incident every 4 to 5 days over the past month. And you start to see why maritime advisories stopped hedging their language. Mine risk reporting specifically. Inside the traffic separation scheme, the exact lanes ships are supposed to use to avoid collisions and stay in monitored waters means the danger isn't confined to open water anymore. It's inside the very corridors designed to keep transit orderly and safe. Combine that with what the advisory calls continued hailing and roading pressure from Iranian forces, meaning ships are being actively stopped, questioned, and redirected by the IRGC Navy as a matter of routine, not exception, and the picture that emerges is of a waterway where the rules of safe passage have effectively broken down, regardless of what either government's official position claims about whether it's open or closed. To put mine risk reporting into real terms, a naval mine doesn't discriminate between a warship and a container vessel carrying consumer goods to a port thousands of miles away. It sits in the water, often invisible from the surface, until something triggers it. Any credible report of mines inside an active shipping lane forces every captain moving through that lane into an impossible calculation, trusting either their own instruments, secondhand intelligence, or simple luck, none of which offer real certainty. That's part of why insurers treat mine risk language differently from almost any other category of threat on these advisories. It's not a risk you can navigate around with good timing or a skilled crew. It's a risk that exists whether or not anything visible is happening on the surface at all. What makes this moment genuinely difficult to read is that both sides are, in their own way, telling a story that sounds almost reasonable from the inside. Washington sees a ceasefire that Iran has repeatedly violated with attacks on shipping, justifying renewed strikes as accountability rather than aggression. Tehran, through its newly consolidated leadership, sees a country that was cautiously reopening a waterway on its own terms, only to have that process disrupted by an outside power with, in their words, no legitimate stake in the region at all. Neither government, in its public statements this week, is presenting itself as the side escalating first. Both are presenting themselves as reacting to the other. And that specific dynamic, 2 sides each convinced they're only responding to provocation, is exactly the kind of situation that historically produces the longest, hardest to resolve conflicts, because nobody involved believes they're the one who needs to back down. So where does that actually leave things? With a severe threat rating now in effect, a newly installed supreme leader backed by the most aggressive military faction in the country, and a promise of grave consequences still hanging in the air, unfulfilled as of right now. Maritime advisories don't come with expiration dates or predictions about what happens next. They simply describe the present moment as accurately as their analysts can manage, and right now that description is about as stark as this war has produced. Shipping companies are left making decisions with incomplete information, the same way they have been for months, weighing insurance costs against the risk of losing a vessel, weighing government reassurances against the actual pattern of attacks on the water. There's also a broader question sitting quietly behind all of this that's worth asking directly. Every previous flashpoint in this war, the naval blockade, the failed talks in Islamabad, the memorandum signed in Versailles, eventually produced some kind of shift, a ceasefire, a pause, a renewed round of negotiations. What makes this moment feel different isn't just the severe rating or the grave consequences warning on their own. It's that both of those are now backed by a leadership structure in Tehran that's more consolidated, more singularly aligned with its hardline military wing, and arguably less likely to be pulled back toward compromise by competing internal voices than at any earlier point in this 5-month conflict. Whether that consolidation makes Iran more predictable or less predictable going forward is genuinely unclear, and it's the kind of uncertainty that tends to make already nervous markets and already exhausted diplomats even more cautious about assuming they know what happens next. And somewhere in Tehran, a leadership structure that's now more consolidated and more clearly aligned with its most hardline military branch than at any earlier point in this war is deciding, in real time, what grave consequences is actually going to mean, and to whom, and how soon. Nobody outside that small circle knows yet. Everyone on the water is about to find out.